usually hear about. During this time period, there it goes again. Why is that doing that? Is the Magruder Massacre. The gold rush attracted this very eclectic population of people, and really all manner of humanity sort of flocked to the gold fields everywhere, not just to Montana. But there was this interesting limerick that I think says a lot. And the limerick goes, so what was your name in the States? Was it Johnson or Thompson or Bates? Did you murder your wife? Did you run for your life? What was your name in the States? And that really tells you, that you didn't know who your neighbors were. A lot of people came here to lose themselves. People came to change their identities. People came, really wanting to escape things. And so you really had to be very careful who you associated with. You hear a lot about the murders and the robberies that were occurring along the roadways during this early period. And the territory of Idaho was impossibly huge, and east of the divide, there was no governmental presence. So there's really no evidence to support the numbers that you sometimes read in the sources. Some places, some people claim that there were at least 100 murders along the roadways, but one ghastly crime that I think you really don't hear very much about that really did frighten people was the Magruder Massacre, which occurred on the roadway between Virginia City and Lewiston, Idaho. And that was, it was a really terrible crime. There were Lloyd Magruder, who was a very well-respected businessman, which is why it caused such consternation. And 4 of his companions, along with about 70 pack mules, were brutally murdered. And people were eventually caught. There were 4 perpetrators. 3 of them were hanged. Those were the first legal hangings in the territory of Idaho. But Magruder, as I say, was a really well-known citizen, and the situation really made an indelible impression on people. And today, those murders we know actually implicated the infamous Sheriff Plummer, which I'm not really going to talk about that, but there's reason to believe he wasn't such a good guy. And that roadway is today called the Magruder Corridor, and it is the most remote, the most isolated area in the United States, surrounded by 1 million acres of wilderness area, and it is really quite an experience to drive over Nez Perce Pass along this way. So soon after the event, the Magruder Massacre, George Ives' miners' court trial and conviction was the first of several dozen vigilante hangings that are still controversial. Ives' hanging was the catalyst toward the forming of the vigilantes in December of 1863. And after the last of some 24 vigilante hangings, Joseph Slade was the last one in March of 1864. These splinter groups continued to do their work elsewhere in defiance of the law, really, in Helena, and even after that, Stuart Stranglers hanged some 65 people in the 1880s. So, things were still going on. And if you visit the homeland, you can see a couple of relics, including this rope that may have been used in one of those hangings. So those people who headed west had to overcome really deep-seated fears of the wilderness, of Indians, of disease, of river crossings, and of accidents. Fear, however, was, of course, somewhat tempered by the potential freedom from the terrible struggles of the Civil War that was going on, and the promise of high adventure, and the opportunity to make a new start. Montana's three major gold rushes, as I mentioned, the first was in 1862 at Grasshopper Creek, which became Bannock. The second in 1863 was at Alder Gulch, which became Virginia and Nevada cities. And in 1864 here at Last Chance, which became Helena. And again, they drew all kinds of people who came to, in the language of the time, they came to see the elephant, which was the expression for gold rush adventure. The territory of Montana was carved from Idaho Territory on May 26, 1864, and I think people don't usually realize that that was the exact anniversary of the discovery the year before at Alder Gulch, which was, gold was discovered there on May 26, 1863. And so the territory of Montana was created on May 26, 1864. It was the very first time that eastern and western, eastern and western halves of Montana were joined together. Montana was in a state of flux, and as I said before, changes happened very, very fast. And again, it's important to remember that this was not an empty land. You know, there were many, many people who lived here, had lived here for generations and generations. And the presence of newcomers really was an intrusion on the lifeways that were thousands of years in the making. So I encourage you to visit Neither Empty Nor Unknown to better understand the rich cultures that did exist here long before contact with Euro-Americans. Now, J.L. Campbell traveled through Idaho Territory and wrote a travel manual in 1863 that was called Idaho, 6 Months in the New Gold Diggings, The Emigrant's Guide. And it was published in 1864. What you see here is the second edition, and the name had to be changed to Idaho and Montana because, of course, the creation of the territory of Montana in 1864. But, you know, by the time it was published the first time, it was already out of date. Idaho's new gold diggings were no longer in Idaho, but actually in Montana Territory. So, as I say, this is the second printing of that travel guide. And Campbell gives this really interesting advice to travelers heading west. He notes the best camping places, the places where you can find water, what to bring with you, and he includes ads for outfitters and provisioners and different modes of transportation. In addition to the usual staples, he recommends that you bring eggs packed in sawdust and butter packed in crocks of salt, because he says that these items will especially be appreciated on the trail. We can only imagine how much they might have been appreciated. In general, the gold rush, he says, is like a lottery. A few may strike it rich, but most people are going to draw blanks. And remember, he says, not everyone needs to mine. Good money is to be made providing goods and services to those caught up in mining. And so this travel guide really became a Bible for many people who traveled west. The difference between a territory and a state, and I just kind of want to go over this briefly, is really important and significant. Citizens of a territory had really very little to say in government. Legislative and judicial powers were by presidential appointment, not elected by the people. And decisions were made by officials who really knew very little about Montana and its problems. The main officials were the governor, the secretary, the chief justice, and 2 associate justices. The governor was commander of the militia and also Indian superintendent, and the secretary had exclusive authority to spend federal funds and became acting governor in the absence of the governor. The members of the 2 House legislature were actually elected by popular vote, white males only over 21 or over, but this led to clashes with the appointed officials who, again, were not usually very familiar with Montana and Montana's problems and needs. So kind of hold that thought, if you would. Now, Sidney Edgerton was the first territorial governor, having first come west, appointed Chief Justice of the Territory of Idaho under President Lincoln. Edgerton recognized the vastness of Idaho territory right away and the lack of law enforcement. And this was such a huge geographical area. So with gold sewn in his clothing, he traveled to Washington and the congressman from Ohio, which is where Edgerton was from, James M. Ashley, took up the cause and actually presented the case for a new territory to Congress. President Lincoln then appointed Edgerton the first governor of Montana Territory. And this was, and the executive residence, of course, was at Bannock. Montana's population grew very, very quickly and grew to become one of the most ethnically diverse places in the West. There's one journalist who says that you could hear more languages spoken on the streets of Helena than in any other place. Just hard to imagine that. So we might think of Montana in the mid-1860s as remote and very sparsely populated, but it was also just a remarkably busy place. The gold rushes came in the twilight of the trapping and fur trading era. And that era had its own culture that really, to some extent, intertwined with the various Native American tribes and newcomers to the territory. So I'm going to talk about that for just a moment. Mixed marriages were desirable and necessary in fur trade culture. For negotiating trade, and even multiple wives were entirely acceptable. Some of Montana's key players were part of this very interesting fur trade culture. Johnny Grant, for example, was one. He was the son of a Hudson's Bay trader and the product of Indian, American, and Canadian cultures. By the mid-1860s, he had a very well-established ranch in the Deer Lodge Valley and offered warm hospitality to anyone who happened to drop by. Grant hosted many all-night balls and parties where guests noted there was a very colorful mix of calico and buckskins. Grant had many children with at least 4 Native American wives of various tribes. His main wife, Cara, was a Bannock woman who presided over the house that is there today that was Montana's very first high-style dwelling, built in 1862. If you visit the Grant Coors Ranch, and everyone should visit that because it is an important part of Montana's heritage, it's a National Historic Landmark and a national park also. Its early history really symbolizes the beginning of the end of a microcosm of cultural harmony. Johnny Grant himself was a Métis of mixed French and Canadian background, as I mentioned, and the early settlement of Deer Lodge was home to a very eclectic mix of people, trappers and mountain men, their Indian wives. There were Spanish vaqueros or cowboys from Mexico. There were French-speaking Canadians. There were people from most Montana tribes speaking their individual languages. But with the gold rush, some newcomers didn't like this cultural mix, and particularly they didn't like the practice of plural wives. And so Grant, who spoke French, was harassed and taken advantage of, and arsonists burned his best barn. The revenue officer came around and confiscated the liquor in his saloon, taxed him more than anybody else. And in 1866, finally, Johnny Grant sold his ranch to Conrad Coors and took his family and his huge herd of horses to safer ground in Manitoba, Canada. But other prominent early Montana pioneers were also part of this twilight culture and stayed here. Among them were Major Alexander Culbertson and his Blackfeet wife, Natawista, and Malcolm Clark, who was simultaneously married to 2 different women, good singing woman, a pagan, and Kothkakona, a Blackfeet woman. He had children with each of them, and they all lived together. Granville Stewart's first wife, Bonnie, was a Shoshone woman. Natawista Culbertson, Kothkakona Clark, and Bonnie Stewart negotiated important geographical and cultural frontiers. Both Stewart and Malcolm Clark were involved in the early territorial affairs, and both were among the far-sighted founders of the Montana Historical Society in 1865, and you can see where the two arrows are pointing to their names. There was also Robert Dempsey, who I guess was quite a character. A lot of the outlaws supposedly hung out at his Twin Bridges ranch. But he had 2 Native American wives and also a household full of children by both of them. The Dempsey family spent some time in Bannock before they settled on their ranch near Twin Bridges. And the Dempsey daughters that you see here, when Maggie was 10 and Mary was 8, they very carefully watched the miners in Grasshopper Creek. And Maggie especially studied this procedure of swirling the pans in that. So she and her sister went to their mother's kitchen and they got a pan. And they imitated the miners, slushing and swirling the water and the gravel around. And then they saw something gleaming in the bottom of the pan. And so they ran to show their father, and he got so excited that they had discovered gold on the banks of the creek. So Dempsey immediately set off for town to file a claim on behalf of the 2 girls. But before he reached there, he had to stop off at a couple of watering holes. There were a lot of those in Bannock at the time. And he began to brag about Maggie and Mary. And when he finally reached the claim office, the claim had already been taken by someone else. So the girls never did get their mining claim. Now there's no documentation, but among the newcomers who came over the divide from the Salmon River area to Montana Territory included, I'm sure, hundreds of Chinese miners who made up 10% of the overall territorial population by 1870. In 1865, Virginia City also had a prominent Jewish community, and where the arrow is, pointing to the Hebrew cemetery that was on the original plat map for Virginia City, drawn in 1868, platted in 1868. By that time, however, there were very few Jews left, as it's really interesting to study this time period, because if you get familiar with the names, you'll find certain names in Bannock and families, and then you'll find them again in Virginia City, and then you'll find them again in Helena. And it's just sort of like the whole population leapfrogged from one place to another. And that's certainly true of Virginia City. So by the time Virginia City was actually formally platted, although the Hebrew cemetery was platted in there, we don't really think that anyone was actually buried in the cemetery. There were also African Americans who came. This is the Home of Peace, which we find a lot of Virginia City Jews were buried actually here, which began in 1867. This is that little cemetery tucked behind Capitol High School, opened in 1867, very early. So there were also African Americans who came seeking new opportunities with the end of the Civil War, and there were other significant immigrant groups also from almost every European country, and especially Irish Catholic immigrants with ties to the Union, but supporters of the Democratic Party. This little, let's see here if I can find this. This little house here in Virginia City, where the arrow is pointing, has a very clandestine history. It needed to be moved a couple of feet because of flooding and the foundation was rotting. And so they essentially took the house apart. And when they took the lath and plaster off of the walls, underneath that, they found Union graffiti. And it is I wish I had an image of it, but it's very faint and it's hard to see. It's an American eagle with a banner in its beak, E pluribus unum it says, and then there are signatures underneath. J.M. Lewis is the first signature, and he was the owner of the property at the time. And then it was covered up with a lath and plaster, and it's kind of indicative of the fact that the unionists were kind of in the minority at that point. And this house was built in 1863, before the end of the Civil War, certainly, and it's probably one of the first frame houses built in Virginia City. But the other thing about it is that when they took the house apart, they found that it was actually almost a kit. All of the pieces were numbered and everything fit together, so there's no nails used in its construction. And it was brought from somewhere else and assembled there. We really don't know where it was originally made or who might have made it, but it is a very unique situation, and also indicative of the need for, you know, some of these people to hide their loyalties. So along with the miners, the merchants, the gamblers, and the ubiquitous prostitutes that followed the gold rush came families. And they came armed with their Campbell guidebooks, you can just imagine. And they were representative of changing times. These pioneers, unlike the others who really only intended to make a fortune and leave, these folks were seeking permanence. By 1864, stages ran 3 times a week from Virginia City to Salt Lake City. It was a 4-day trip traveling day and night. The fare cost $25. And local stages frequently ran between Virginia City and Helena, Fort Benton, and Bannock. It's just hard for me to imagine that people would travel great distances in the wintertime with snow and blizzards and whatever, but people did do that. And Harriet Sanders, for one, took her 2 little boys back east to Ohio in the middle of a blizzard in January. They had a rather horrendous trip, but you know, they did it anyway, and it's just, it's amazing that people, with sickness the way it was and everything, it's just amazing that people did that. Slabs of soapstone were heated and placed on the floors of the stagecoaches, but there wasn't any soapstone in the territory, and unless somebody brought something like that with them, they had to substitute a slab of hardwood. And what they would do is place the wood or the soapstone, if they were lucky enough to have that, in the oven at the stage stops, and it would heat up, and they would put that on the floor of the stagecoach and keep their feet warm. Of course, that had to be provided by the traveler, and it wasn't provided by the stage company. Meals at stage stops usually consisted of very poorly made biscuits, canned beans, canned tomatoes, poured into a bowl with no salt, no seasonings. And when the snow was too deep, passengers could actually get stranded for days. Everyone slept on buffalo robes if they brought them along with them. They would spread them out on the floor around the stove to keep warm, to sleep at night. And sometimes, you know, there was a cabin, but more often than not, passengers shared the stable with the livestock. There were swing stations just about every 10 to 13 miles, and those provided fresh horses. The drivers worked in shifts of about 50 miles apiece. Frances Rowe wrote this wonderful, or collected her letters in a book called Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, describing a trip through the Prickly Pear Canyon. And she says that when a heavily laden freight train on the narrow path met with a sheer precipice on one side, met a freight train like you see here, the passengers got out of the stage. Baggage and all, the men would lift the stage up onto boulders, and they would just wait. The team would patiently wait by the side edge of the cliff while 3 teams of 8 yoke of oxen passed by. Mrs. Rowe wrote, "It made me ill to see the poor patient oxen straining and pulling up the grade. The crunching and groaning of the wagons, the rattling of enormous cable chains, and the creaks of heavy yokes were awful sounds, and above all came the yells of the driver and the sharp retorts of the long whips. So after the wagon passed, the men then replaced the stage on the road, and the process was repeated 6 or 7 times as the stage traveled through the treacherous canyon. And here's the remnants of part of that road. You just can't imagine how scary that must have been. Now, Malcolm Clark kept a stage stop where the Sebin Ranch is today, which was a partway between the road to Fort Benton and Helena. In the late fall of 1865, this is the first photograph of Helena taken at that time period, there was a party of prominent officials that struck out from Helena on horseback on the way to Fort Benton to aid treaty negotiations with the Blackfeet and to witness the distribution of annuities. Well, among those officially traveling with the party was Judge Lyman Munson, who wrote of the overnight stay at the Clark's ranch, noting that the horses were picketed around the haystacks so they could forage, and the men slept under a shed that was meant to shelter horses. I mean, they weren't even invited inside. They slept with rifles loaded at their sides as guards patrolled the camp, revealing that no one was entirely safe. In fact, several years later, in 1869, Blackfeet relatives murdered Clark in front of his family there at the ranch. There were non-existent social services. We have an article from the Montana Post talking about 3 children begging in the streets of Virginia City while the father gambled in Nevada City, and it identifies the oldest girl, who was about 12 at the time, as Martha Jane Canary, who later became Calamity Jane. And Thomas Dimsdale was a really important character during this time period. He was the editor of the Montana Post, which was Montana's first newspaper. And he was also the author of the Vigilantes of Montana, published in segments in his newspaper. But also, he gathered kids together and taught a private school. And kids were pretty much running wild. If you read Mary Ronan's reminiscence about Thomas Dimsdale, I don't think he was a very good teacher. I don't think he ever taught the kids, because she says, you know, that he was always writing, and she always imagined he was writing his book, The Vigilantes of Montana, and really not teaching the kids. But he did gather them off the streets, which was a blessing to parents, because kids were exposed to all kinds of violence and vices. He died of tuberculosis in 1866, just after he was appointed the first superintendent of public schools. But, you know, he never was very well. And a lot of people came west because they were what they called lungers. They had tuberculosis, and talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Much has been made of about the lines of allegiance, and I talked about that in that graffiti house. The lines of allegiance that were drawn in Montana before the end of the Civil War. Southerners really dominated the area, and at least until the end of the Civil War in 1865, there were skirmishes and tempers sometimes did flare. Virginia City was almost named Varina. Isn't she beautiful? It's Varina Davis, who, of course, Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy. And Virginia City was almost named Varina, but G.G. Bissell, who was filing the official papers, changed the name because he was a Unionist and changed it to Virginia City. Anton Holter tells a very interesting story of planting the first American flag in Nevada City on the 4th of July in 1864. Before that, the Bonnie Blue flag of the Confederacy was the only flag that ever flew in Nevada City. But the sheriff gathered together some known Union sympathizers, And Harriet Sanders and Mary Dunphy, who later comes to Helena, made a U.S. flag, and they kept it hidden between the blankets of Mrs. Sanders' bed. So knowing that Holter had these Union sympathies, the sheriff asked him to be present when they raised the American flag. And I guess it was quite a scene, because everyone was armed. And as they began to raise the flag, you could hear the guns cocking on both sides, you know. And there were two rabble-rousers that were escorted out of the crowd, but the flag was raised, it was accomplished, and there was no bloodshed. And after that, the American flag flew at Nevada City. Lincoln was assassinated in mid-April of 1865. It took 2 weeks for word of the assassination to come to Virginia City by stage. That was the fastest news had ever traveled, 2 weeks. And Mary Ronan danced for joy, as she tells us in her memoir, with her Southern friends, and then her father chastised her for doing that because he says, you know, Mary, I'm a Unionist, you know, and I'm always for the Lincoln, even though I'm a Democrat. Harriet Sanders writes about parties that Southern women planned because of the death of Lincoln. And there were all those kinds of things going on. But just a few weeks later, when the Civil War was over, Nevada City was again just full of activity. Look at the crowds there. This is the only early photograph that we have of Nevada City, taken on the 4th of July, 1865. And it was on this occasion, just after the end of the Civil War, that Virginia City resident by the name of Julia Gormley tells a little story about Civil War loyalties in Alder Gulch. She says that on that first 4th of July, just after the Civil War was over, the Forbes sisters, who were very good singers, were invited to sing at the celebration in Virginia City. Well, the sisters were Southerners from Missouri, and they had lost their home, they had lost everything, and suffered greatly at the hands of Union soldiers. At first, they were very indignant to have been asked to sing at such a celebration like that. But Julia goes on to say that she took her children to see the Independence Day parade, which Mary Ronan actually describes, that went on in Virginia City. And Julia says, and I quote, "It was really a very fine thing to see the good feeling between the Southern and Northern people, strangers to each other, joined so heartily together on that 4th in '65. And as the Forbes sisters later got over it, they had a good laugh about the whole thing. But here in Helena, the one reminder of the days of separation is the former Methodist Episcopal Church South. We had a South Methodist and a Northern Methodist. St. Paul's was the northern one. And this was the Northern Church, which is now over on Warren Street, now the Helena Labor Temple. But you know, there was never any animosity between the two groups. The Northern Methodist Episcopals and the Southern Methodist Episcopals worshiped often together. They fundraised together. They had events together. And it wasn't until 1933, however, that the North and the South Methodist Episcopal churches were formally united, and then St. Paul's absorbed the Southern congregation, which I think is kind of cool. Travel by stagecoach or by steamboat was certainly monotonous, but children a lot of times had great fun crossing the plains and camping out without the responsibilities or worries of their parents. Children were well informed and they became seasoned travelers. Dorinda Butts, whose family settled in the Pioneer Cabin in 1865, came to Helena with them, but she tells of this really scary incident that happened on the trail that taught the kids a lesson. Kids were told never to stray very far from the circle of wagons when they camped at night. And one evening, the kids all got together and they were laughing and playing around, and they kind of went up the hill, up the trail a little ways, and they got to the top of this hill, and all of a sudden they saw this figure stripped to the waist that was sort of lurking behind bushes. And the kids got really scared, and they screamed and screamed and screamed and ran home all the way, ran back to the wagons and told their parents that there were Indians up there on the hill. And it turns out it was actually one of the men in the wagon train teaching the kids a lesson, and they never strayed after that. The tragedy, though, of the Thomas party does illustrate how sometimes parents put their own desires ahead of the safety of their children. William Thomas, his 7-year-old son Charlie, and their driver set out in 1866 from Illinois to join part of the family that was already settled in the Gallatin Valley on a farm. William Thomas had lost his wife and twin daughters to pneumonia. And so they really wanted a new start, and they started out. And William's diary is this really creepy, very strangely foreboding diary where he makes all these strange remarks. But he talks about how cold chills run through my blood when he looks at the mountains and things like that. Among the diaries that are kept by people traveling on the Bozeman Trail, this one does stand out as maybe the most poignant and the most tragic reminder of the real dangers that people did face. So they were anxious to move at a faster pace than the wagon train, and so the party broke off from the main group despite the fact that they were warned. And so they camped near the Yellowstone River at present-day Gray Cliff, so you can see sort of on the map there where that happened. The next day, other travelers came upon their campsite. All three were full of arrows. William's diary was found in his pocket, and that has come to the Montana Historical Society along with the artifacts that were left, including these reeds which outlined the bodies, and they are cloth-tied pods. Probably they have tobacco in them, but they have never been opened. And Charlie's one little boot, the other boot was never found. But it is a sad reminder that, not everyone made it to Montana safely. So travel could be accomplished by steamboats only during the warmer months. And it was sometimes very frustrating because twists and turns in the river were unexpected, and you could really never exactly tell how long it was going to take. Normally, the trip from Missouri, usually from St. Joseph, Missouri, took about 6 weeks or about 40 days to travel. And there were frequent stops because they had to fuel the boilers, cut wood, and in 1867, this is the levee there in Fort Benton. In 1867, the Abiona departed St. Joseph, Missouri in late April. It was supposed to arrive in Fort Benton on the 1st of June, but actually it took 80 days and it didn't arrive until July 13th. And that's really not terribly atypical. So you just really couldn't count on steamboat travel. Now, Virginia City became the territorial capital, which moved from Bannock in early 1865. And in the fall of 1865, Thomas Francis Meagher arrived to take office as the territorial secretary appointed by President Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Lincoln. This was the executive residence with the flag there that you see. It was really very different from the home the Meaghers were used to in New York City, I can tell you. The great turmoil during his particular administration from September 1865 to his mysterious death in July of 1867 is largely, I think, because of the flaws in the territorial system. As I mentioned before, the governor was commander of the militia. The territorial secretary could spend federal funds, and that was a very dangerous combination there. And so when Thomas Francis Meagher became the acting governor, he had almost unlimited power. He could decide what to spend money on. He could write the checks. He was also a Democrat, which didn't set well with a lot of the outspoken radical Republicans in the territory at the time. Suffice it to say, Meagher had many detractors and many enemies, and the often told story of his death is probably Montana's greatest unsolved mystery. But, you know, it's a question of whether he fell off of the steamboat that was docked at Fort Benton, or whether he was pushed, or whether he was shot and fell, or whether he jumped. You know, really don't know. His body was never recovered. But recently, there is one account of Meagher's death that has surfaced from Eugene Tucker, who was a soldier stationed at Fort Shaw. And Tucker wrote to his parents on August 18, 1867, saying that he had witnessed General Meagher jump overboard and commit suicide. You know, it's just one of those pieces, and we'll probably never know for sure what really did happen. Although Meagher's home that you see here in Virginia City was itself rather rustic, other people lived in just incredibly primitive conditions. Dr. Andrew Jackson Hunter and his family arrived at Confederate Gulch, having moved west from Virginia to Illinois and then to Missouri and finally to Montana. Dr. Hunter served as a Confederate surgeon and sought relief from the financial and the emotional upheaval of the Civil War. So he was one of those folks that was actually escaping the war. He and his family, including his wife, their 4 children under 6, and his 2 brothers, it's a large family, lived in a tent for almost 2 years. There were hides tacked to the walls and covering the floor, which was the usual winter insulation in temporary quarters like that. The log cabins had dirt floors initially until planks could be laid, and mostly they had sod roofs. When it rained, the sod soaked up water like a sponge, and muddy water would run down the inside of the cabin, and with a dirt floor, just imagine that, you know. They had residents use every conceivable receptacle to catch drips, cups, buckets, pans, everything. But the floors were just a sea of mud. It's just unbelievable, you know, that people lived under those circumstances. One-room cabins often sheltered very large families. Sometimes they would make partitions with calico to divide bedrooms off. The Pioneer Cabin here in Helena was built in the front part was built in 1865 and housed the family of Dorinda Jane Butts that we talked about before. It was a family of 5, and they lived there for 2 years. If you've ever been in the Pioneer Cabin, it's a pretty small room. It may seem odd to think of a fancy chandelier like this or fine furniture in a very primitive cabin, but you know, people brought the things with them that mattered to them, like this Civil War era bathtub. Cherished items like heirloom dishes and fancy linens and kerosene chandeliers and furnishings were packed in steamer trunks or in covered wagons, and they had to use them as, you know, wherever they settled of necessity. And so sometimes elegant furnishings were used in these very primitive dwellings. Now this belt buckle commemorates a cat named Faithful Albert. And it recalls a peculiar commodity that one day arrived at Virginia City in a merchant's wagon. So there was this merchant who brought a very large box, and he parked his wagon on the main street, and there was all kinds of noises, weird noises coming from this box. And so people just crowded around to see what was in this box. And these were the first cats that were brought to Virginia City, to Montana, not really to Montana Territory because there were cats at St. Mary's Mission, but they were the first ones that were brought to Virginia City. And they came all the way from Salt Lake City. Those poor cats, can you just imagine? So the town at the time had a terrible problem with rats and mice, and there weren't any cats. And so the merchant began to auction his cats off. And the first cat brought $5, and the second cat brought $10, and the next cat brought $20, and then there was one cat left. And no one would bid on it because he said, well, it's the last one, it's probably no good. And the merchant was very clever, and he said, but this cat, I've saved it till the very last, and it's the best one. And he sold that one for $40 in gold. And there are the same cats generations and generations later that are still around feral in the hills in Virginia City. And I'll tell you, this cat, I apologize if it grosses anyone out, but this petrified cat was taken from a porch where it died in about 1868, and this has to be one of the original cats or the offspring of those original cats. And you can see it in the Thompson-Hickman Museum if you're of a mind to. So miners were often, usually, very careless with their water sources. And there were terrible typhoid and cholera epidemics that resulted. Thomas Dimsdale's Montana Post, which, as I mentioned, was the first newspaper that began publishing in 1863, infrequently covered these epidemics because it freaked out the population, and they just simply didn't write about that. It's very difficult now for us to study those epidemics because there's no record. The newspapers just really didn't want to cover that. And so it's hard to know what the diseases really were and how widespread they were. I read once a doctor wrote a little article and said that anytime you have 5 people that have the same disease at the same time, you have an epidemic. So whether that correlates to Virginia City and the gold camps, I don't really know. But there are lots of examples of people who died. In fact, Matilda Dalton lost both her parents in 1864, and it's her parents that are buried along with those 5 road agents on Boot Hill in Virginia City. But their death, left Matilda with 3 very young siblings that she had to take care of. And so, the only thing she could do, there were no job opportunities for women, and so the only thing really she could do was get married. And she did that to provide her siblings with security. Typhoid was not only spread through contaminated water, but it was also spread by houseflies. And people didn't realize that houseflies, were not very sanitary. Butcher shops like the Highland Meat Market here had no wrapping paper, and so meat was carried home on a stick, which was an open invitation to flies, and consumption also was a major illness. People came to the Rocky Mountain region thinking that the cold mountain air would cure them, and that was the case with Rodney Pocock, who was a medical doctor and came to Helena thinking that he was going to get well. But he didn't realize that the conditions were so primitive, and he spent the winter in a badly chinked cabin, and the snow blew over his blankets, and by March he was dead. Rodney Street is named for him. He was the first white person to die in Helena. Mountain fever was another sort of mysterious disease, like it's not the same thing as Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That was called black measles. But mountain fever is mentioned very often in the diaries, and a lot of people died of that, especially travelers and people who were not familiar, were first coming, to the Rocky Mountain region. It may have been Colorado tick fever, not the same thing, as I said, as Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but it could be that it was that, or it could be that it was a catch-all for different diseases. We really don't know. Some people recovered from it. Some people died along the trail. And also, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, measles, those were children's diseases that were just sometimes rampant in the mining camps and also in the wagon train groups. Mining camps were at the mercy of freighters who brought supplies, everything you couldn't make, you had to have shipped in. All mining camps suffered shortages of staples in the wintertime when animals couldn't get through the mountain passes. Pack trains were grocery stores. Francis Gilbert Albright recalled that freighters would line up on Wallace Street in Virginia City, and the merchants would sell the staples out of the backs of their wagons. And by the way, I should mention that Wallace Street, the main street in Virginia City, is one of few reminders that Montana was once Idaho territory, because Wallace Street is named for William Wallace, who was the first governor of Idaho Territory. Stories abound about freighters, being caught in snowstorms, and such delays caused rationing of supplies, and the infamous flour riots in Virginia City, when there was a committee of citizens that stormed through houses confiscating hoarded flour. Private companies tried to improve the delivery system, and for a very brief time, between about 1865 and 1866, camels did carry supplies over the Mullen Road to the mining camps. That's a whole nother story, but it sounded like a great idea because camels could carry up to 1,000 pounds of flour. They needed very little food and water. They were sort of like the postal service, neither rain nor sleet nor snow stopped them. And bullwhackers and mule skinners hated camels, though, because if mules met a camel train coming the other way, they could smell camel stench on the wind. Camels had a very strange odor, and the mules would bolt every time. And so one particular incident where there was a mule train that had a supply of whiskey destined for Missoula met a camel train coming the other way. And needless to say, all the whiskey spilled down the mountainside, and the 4th of July was dry, and the camel experiment was pretty much over by then. There were 3 theatrical troupes and circuses that traveled to Montana from the very earliest times. The first one performed at Bannock and Virginia City and Helena in 1867. They drew a crowd of about 100 people in Virginia City, and it was a much anticipated event. Bartholomew's horses, however, were the main attraction, and they were very, very smart. He always said that his horses were smarter than children. And they were highly, highly skilled. If you Google Bartholomew's horses, you can find out a lot of cool information about them. Virginia City was known as the social city, and although Helena had its own fair share of theatrical troupes that came despite the hazards of traveling, communities also had their own thespians. And in wintertime, when the streams froze and the placer mining had to stop, there were sleigh rides with buffalo hides piled on passengers to keep them warm. There were oyster suppers and spelling bees and games of chess. And everyone attended dances, and there were so few women that even the young girls were sought after as partners. And of course, there was the ubiquitous adult entertainments. Virginia City had 70 licensed saloons. There are no documented or identifiable hurdy-gurdy houses or places of repute in Montana still standing that date to this early time period. People like to say, that this place or that place was used for that purpose, but there's really no documentation for that. Bare knuckle boxing was all the rage, and in fact, the American record for the longest match, 185 rounds, took place in Virginia City in 1865. Thomas Dimsdale wrote about every single round with relish and about every single drop of blood that was spilled. I always thought that was funny because he was such a mild-mannered little guy. Everything that people couldn't bring with them, as I said before, had to be brought in from somewhere else, like this chair, for example, made from an oxbow and a cutting board. And women did beautiful embroidery and brought these skills to the frontier. Horn furniture was popular and commonly embellished with needlepoint, like this one done by Augusta Kors, which is beautiful. And also note the buffalo horn furniture in the homeland. If you want to go see that, it's pretty cool. Families who came west didn't know if they would see their family members again, and so they would clip locks of hair in remembrance. And this was a common practice. Locks were sometimes woven into jewelry. There's some hair jewelry in the homeland also that you can see, or large wreaths like this. And you could learn that from a manual. Although vigilante hangings were over in 1864, hangings in Helena had just begun. And this tree, of course, you're probably all familiar with that, served as gallows for at least a dozen victims. Judge Lyman Munson, who came in 1865 as the Territorial Associate Justice, claims that there were 8 uses of the hangman's tree before he got here in 1865. We have no record of that, but maybe that's true. Yeah, so just a couple of these here. And this one, the last hanging on the hangman's tree, the hanging of Compton and Wilson in 1870, this photograph, taken by a woman, actually, Mary Ann Eckert, hung in the hallway of one of our elementary schools until pretty recently. And that's true. In July of 1866, the Creighton brothers, who built this building here, planted the very first telegraph pole on this corner. And service to Salt Lake City then began right after that. It was a huge, huge event, really opening communication with the outside world for the very first time. And hydraulic mining, I just put this picture in here because this is what happened to a lot of the hillsides in all of the mining camps and also in Helena. Very, very destructive second phase of placer mining, and you can see the big hose in the Homeland exhibit. And finally, just a little word about architecture of this period. At Virginia City, you can see the last contiguous visible evidence of life in the 1860s. Bannock and Virginia City have a few scattered buildings. Helena has the Pioneer Cabin, but actually Virginia City has more 1860s buildings than any other town in the American West. The gold rush and the boomtown architecture tell us so much about frontier mentality and the real factors, the real fears and the factors that confronted early residents. As soon as the very first sawmills were operating, they turned out planed boards like this and covered the false fronts, covered the log walls. And it was really, false fronts really didn't offer any particular aesthetic, except they did offer a sense of security in these very wild and remote places, making buildings look bigger than they really were and grander than they really were, giving people a sense of security. Also, the invention of the jigsaw, of the portable jigsaw, made it possible to mimic architectural elements that back east would have been made in brick and stone, but here they're made in wood. Only small 8x10 panes of glass could be used because they couldn't transport anything bigger than that. I think that the small panes of glass are the one thing, to me, that's really very endearing about Virginia City. They would take rubble stone walls. The present day building is there at the bottom. They would take those rubble stone walls that you see exposed, and this is the same building up on the top, and they would cover them with plaster and score the plaster to look like cut stone. And it does look like that, on the bottom part of the building. And Gothic architecture, there's probably more Gothic architecture in Virginia City than any other place. And it was a style that was out of style, really, but it's what people remembered, and so they used that style. And this also has those rubble stone walls with plaster scored to look like stone. The earliest preserved evidence of interior decorating is found at Virginia City. And the method was to take muslin and stretch it over the log walls and then wallpaper the muslin so that it looked like plastered walls. And, it gave the appearance of something that was finished, but it's really just, the importance of these methods are, false fronts, plastered rubble stone, wood ornamentation, and wallpapered muslin. It just emphasizes that frontier architecture was all about illusion, to offer people a sense of security in a place that was very, very remote and very wild during very turbulent times. So this rather eclectic overview ends my talk, and I would be glad to hang around if any of you have questions.